Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. This is an exciting way to start off the Lunch and Learn this semester because I'm usually in the audience, so this time I actually get to present. I am a graduate student here at Tufts in the Department of Biology, and I'll be talking to you today about my favorite bird and my study species, the American Kestrel. Windhover is a somewhat antiquated Old English name for the English relative that was then applied to the American kestrel. They have kestrels in England as well, but a different species. And I just think it's a cool name, which is why I put it in this presentation. So I'm going to be offering a lot of sort of basic introduction on kestrels and that kind of thing. But if you have any questions, you don't need to hold them till the end. By all means, just put your hand up, and I'm happy to address questions as they come up. Nope. I can just stand over here. Okay. So to give you, sorry. Yeah. Like this or? Nope. Doesn't seem like it. That's okay. Let's take this. It's like a wired slide advancer. All right. So to give you a quick overview of what's going to be in the talk. Come on. This won't work either? Okay, well, whatever. Okay, so first off, the first part of my talk is going to be just what exactly is an American Kestrel, and why should anybody care about what an American Kestrel is or how they're doing. Second, what are some possible contributing factors to the decline that we've been observing in this species? Causes, drivers, all that kind of thing. And then finally, what can we do to learn more? And in this case, we mostly means me, because I'm going to be talking about the research that I've been working on and am continuing to work on. But it's also a good example, I think, of how you can take sort of an environmental education. I was an environmental studies major when I was an undergrad, and turn it into a graduate career, at least, in studying specific birds and other animals in need of conservation. So first off, what is a kestrel and why should we care about them? American kestrels, Latin name Falco sparverius, don't worry, there's no quiz, is our smallest falcon species. In fact, it's our smallest bird of prey of any category. They're about 9 inches long from head to tail. The females tend to be a little larger than the males, which is normal in birds of prey. They weigh about 4 ounces. So one kestrel, that's a male being held in the hand, for a everyday comparison is about the equivalent of a stick of butter. Their favorite foods, they are predators. They're small, but they hunt. They like small rodents, voles, mice, that kind of thing, not rats. Rats are way too big. Large insects, grasshoppers and dragonflies, beetles, other large-bodied insects make up quite a large proportion, especially of their summer diet. And small birds. They're birds that eat other birds, which is not uncommon among birds of prey. But they'll take small birds when they can catch them. Their dream home in terms of habitat is a cavity dug by somebody else. They're what we call an obligate secondary cavity nester. Obligate meaning they have to use a cavity. They don't build a stick nest out on a ledge or anything. Secondary meaning they don't build the cavity themselves. They can't. They're not woodpeckers. So they have to find a cavity that was made by some other animal, usually a woodpecker, and then abandoned, and they move in there. And hopefully they have a view of an open field or grassland. Now the reason they want that view of an open field or grassland is because of the way that they hunt. All raptors have sort of subtly different hunting techniques, which is part of what distinguishes them as species. Kestrels, like many raptors, are site-based hunters. Usually they'll perch and they'll scan for prey until they see it, then they'll fly out over it. Sometimes they'll hover directly over the prey, and then they'll drop down on it, which is where the Windhover name comes from. So it's very important for them to have clear sight lines. They can't hunt in the forest because their sight and flight are totally obstructed. So you don't find these birds in the woods. Now, to give you an idea of what a hunting kestrel looks like, I have an embedded video here, which web add-ons can't run. Oh, well, that's a problem. Which link? Sorry. Oh. Well, oh well. We'll just move on. It's okay. So you don't actually get to see it, but they don't technically hover. If you want to be very technical about it, hummingbirds are the only birds that hover. But whenever there's a wind they can fly into, kestrels will face into the wind and flutter so that they make no forward progress, so they can sort of zero in on their prey and then they drop down and grab it. So I promise this is going to be the only slide on which there's a giant block of text which I read to you, despite the fact that you're perfectly capable of reading on your own. But these words were written by J.J. Audubon himself as he was writing his Birds of America back in the 19th century. That's his painting of the American kestrel. The males are down there with the blue wings, the females up there with the kind of orangey brown. We have few more beautiful hawks in the United States than this active little species, and I am sure none half so abundant. Remember that one. It is found in every district from Louisiana to Maine, as well as from the Atlantic shores to the western regions. Everyone knows the sparrowhawk, which is what they used to call the American kestrel. The very mention of its name never fails to bring to mind some anecdote connected with its habits, and as it commits no depredations on poultry, few disturb it, so the natural increase of the species experiences no check from man. Well, if that was the case in Audubon's time, which strictly speaking it probably wasn't, it certainly didn't remain the case for very long. So if this was the most abundant hawk in all of the United States, then what's the problem? Well, their numbers have been declining through the years. This data is from the Breeding Bird Survey, which is a federal survey. It's run every year. They count abundances of all of the breeding birds they can find during the summer along a whole bunch of routes all across the country. This is a survey-wide index. So this covers all of North America, and kestrels even get down into South America. As far north as Alaska, as far south as Tierra del Fuego, and pretty much anywhere in between where there's suitable habitat. So this index here is basically the average number of birds seen per survey. So back in 1966, when the survey started, you saw on average a kestrel and a half on a breeding bird survey route. These days, the average is around half that. It's around 0.75 or 0.8 survey-wide. So there's been a 50% decrease in abundance for this species since 1966, which is a pretty serious drop. And the drop is widespread. The bird is widespread, and so is the decline in population. This isn't being driven by one area where they're really getting, taking it on the chin. So this is from a 2009 paper trying to figure out what was going on with kestrels. These black arrows are the statistically significant ones. The white arrows are not statistically significant results. So as you can see, they're significantly declining in many places, or there's no significant results. Nowhere in their range are kestrel numbers significantly increasing right now. So this is a very widely distributed species that's currently undergoing a pretty severe and very widespread decline in abundance. All right, well, sucks to be a kestrel, I guess, but why should we care? Animal populations fluctuate. That's normal, right? Like wildlife populations are dynamic. They increase, they decrease, land use changes, these things happen. So why do we care about kestrels specifically? Well, first of all, because raptors are highly visible and they occupy a high position on the food chain, they've traditionally been pretty important ecological indicators of larger problems. Remember DDT back in the 60s? It was this awful pesticide that was poisoning a lot of the birds, and it resulted in eggshell thinning, so that when birds sat on their eggs to incubate them, the eggs broke. The only reason we realized that DDT was a problem was because the birds started disappearing. And the hardest hit birds were the ones at the top of the food chain, the raptors, peregrine falcons, bald eagles, ospreys. Those were the birds that were almost driven extinct by DDT, and it was thanks to the fact that we noticed a big decline in their numbers that we realized what was going on and banned DDT in this country at least. Second, like I said, these are birds of open country. They need open habitat to forage in. More than 50% of native grassland and savanna habitat in the USA has already been lost. some of it to development, the building of buildings and that sort of thing, some of it to agriculture. And some agriculture, kestrels can hunt in farm areas, but intensive row crop agriculture of like nothing but corn and soybeans for miles and miles and miles is not good kestrel habitat. And grasslands continue to vanish faster than just about any other type of habitat because they're really easy to develop on. You don't have to cut down a bunch of trees before you start building your new strip mall or bypass or whatever it is you want to build. And agricultural lands sometimes need to be expanded to continue feeding growing populations. And it's very easy to turn a grassland into agricultural land because that's basically already what they are. And yet, despite all of these challenges, kestrels remain widespread. They're not past the point of no return. They still occupy a really broad distribution. They're still common enough that we can hopefully do something about it. They're not one of those species that's basically going to be living entirely on the charity of humans because if we stopped helping them, they would disappear in 5 years. And there are some endangered species where, unfortunately, that is the case. But this is a bird where we might have the opportunity to intervene before things get to the crisis point. Okay, so I've talked about what kestrels are and hopefully convinced you that it might be worth our time or effort to save them. So what are some possible contributors to the species decline? Well, I told you about DDT before, and on the one hand, realizing that DDT was a problem and banning it was in many ways kind of the coalescing moment of the modern environmental movement. We had sort of started with birds trying to protect them back at the turn of the 20th century when we said maybe we shouldn't be shooting millions of birds every year to put them on hats. And so we thought we were doing pretty well, I think. Like our track record was looking good. Okay, people are shooting millions of birds, let's stop. DDT is poisoning millions of birds so they can't reproduce, let's stop. But frankly, for those of you who want to go into the environmental field, I think the era of magic bullet solutions is over. We've plucked the low-hanging fruit from the tree of conservation, and very rarely will you find a conservation problem these days that has only one cause. So when I say what's the culprit, the answer is there are probably multiple culprits. What are they? First of all, other birds. This is a Cooper's hawk, a juvenile Cooper's hawk. Cooper's hawks are specialist predators on other birds. They're fast, agile raptors. They're bigger than a kestrel. They have been confirmed to kill and eat kestrels, but we have no idea how often this happens. A kestrel's another raptor. Seems like it'd be a tough thing to take down. Maybe they only do it when they're really desperate, or maybe they're doing it constantly. We have no idea what the size of the effect of Cooper's hawks on kestrels is. But we do know that Cooper's hawks are an increasing species. At the same time, kestrels are a decreasing species. Now, Cooper's hawks tend to hunt in forests, which in Massachusetts at least are actually becoming more common than they used to be. So this could be nothing but changing habitat that's resulting in these two birds sort of having opposite trends. Or it could be something else, like Cooper's hawks eating kestrels. Speaking of habitat, loss of habitat is always something that we have to talk about and consider when we're looking at wildlife populations that aren't doing very well. So as I previously mentioned, kestrels have kind of specific habitat needs. They need a big tree with a cavity in it that was made by another bird to nest in, but they can't and don't nest in forests. So they need a big tree with a hole made by somebody else near a big open field or other grassland of some kind. Could be hard to find. Toxic chemicals. So DDT thankfully has been banned, but there are still plenty of chemicals being introduced into the environment which have negative or in many cases basically unknown effects on wildlife. One of the more troublesome classes of these are the polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs, which are used as flame retardants in your clothes, furniture, all kinds of things that you really don't want to spontaneously combust while you're interacting with them. It's a good and useful function, but these polybrominated diphenyl ethers tend to persist for a long time in the environment. They bioaccumulate, and they're endocrine disruptors, which means that when they get into a bird's system, they disrupt breeding behavior. So their courtship goes wonky, their incubation behavior can be messed with. Again, we don't know how severe the effects of this are on kestrels or how widespread these chemicals are in the environment. There are studies ongoing, but I'm not a toxicologist, so I encourage you to read up on your own if you want to know more about that. And then, of course, there's always disease. When we see a decline in a wildlife population, we think, well, maybe there's some kind of disease. That would be convenient because it's probably not our fault. West Nile virus is pretty familiar to us at this point, but back at the very beginning of the 21st century, around 1999, 2000, it was kind of the hot new thing, and a lot of birds died from it. I mean, a lot. Crows and raptors were especially hard hit by West Nile virus. And it's probable that West Nile virus didn't do kestrels any favors, but recently tests on blood and wild kestrels have shown that something like 95% of wild birds have been exposed to West Nile virus, but they're just fine. So at this point, herd immunity or flock immunity, if you will, has set in. There may have been a dip in population when it was first introduced, but West Nile does not seem to be a big problem right now. So it's likely that all of these things contributed, but for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be concentrating on habitat. Because, again, that's common. It's widely believed to play a role, but nobody really understands how. So what exactly is habitat? If I say kestrels need more habitat, well, like I said, their habitat consists of multiple things. They need a cavity to live in, they need open space to hunt in, and they need perches to hunt from. So their habitat is starting to look kind of complex. And how you assess that habitat is not necessarily the easiest question. We need to protect habitat for kestrels. We need to preserve habitat for kestrels. Okay, all well and good, but what does it actually look like, kestrel habitat? Well, fortunately, we've got a useful tool for figuring it out, which is nest box programs. Kestrels take very readily to artificial nest boxes put up for their use. They're secondary cavity nesters, but it doesn't have to be a woodpecker hole. Human-made cavities can work just fine, which is convenient for us. So there have been nest box programs set up for these birds all across the country. And for other birds like bluebirds and tree swallows, nest box programs actually sort of single-handedly rehabilitated those species. They were previously declining. Nowadays, bluebirds are on the mend. But weirdly, that hasn't really happened with kestrels. They use the nest boxes, they successfully lay their eggs, they fledge their young, but all of the nest box programs across the country, the 7 I'm talking about here happen to submit their data to a scientific paper, so that's why I say 7, but I've heard this from a lot of other nest box programs as well, have been reporting declining occupancy as of 2009. So you put out the boxes, a bunch of them get kestrels in them, you think, great, we're going to save the species, and then as the years go by, fewer and fewer kestrels are occupying those boxes. Kind of mysterious. So why should the nest boxes go unused if we think loss of habitat is a limiting factor for kestrel numbers? Well, maybe that habitat isn't as good as we thought it was. We can put up a lot of boxes, but if we're not putting them up in what's actually good habitat, then it's not going to be any use to the kestrels. And like I said, they need short vegetation with high visibility. And in Massachusetts and other places in the country, if you don't look at a grassland for 5 years, it turns into a scrubland. And if you don't look at it for 10 more years, it turns into a young forest. So boxes that were in perfectly good habitat 5 years ago might now be in not so good habitat just because nobody's been mowing or burning or otherwise maintaining the grassland. So now I go into the what can we do and or what have I been doing to try and learn a little bit more about this. All right, so habitat selection is sort of complicated sounding from a wildlife perspective, but we understand it intuitively, or we can, I think, because all of us need to select habitat too at some point. So let's use the example of off-campus housing. You need to find a place to live. You're not a kestrel, but you do still need somewhere to live, right? So let's think about this at multiple scales. Zooming out at the farthest scale, the landscape scale, you want to live somewhere close to Tufts, probably. So you want to live in Somerville or in Medford or something like that. You probably don't want to live out in the ocean. In fact, you can't live out in the ocean. Well, not without having a lot of money in a houseboat. But the point is, if we're looking at habitat at the coarsest scale, for the human Tufts student, these areas are suitable habitat in the green rings. That area is not suitable habitat. So if you think about it for kestrels, very broadly speaking, open areas, suitable habitat. Dense forest, not suitable habitat. So let's zoom in to that first green circle that was around Medford. So there's Tufts, which theoretically you'd like to live nearby since you're going there and you want to be able to have a nice convenient commute. So everything before was suitable habitat in here, remember. This was a giant circle where we said suitable. But within here, there are areas that are suitable. There's residential neighborhoods where you might be able to find a place to rent. And there's areas that are not suitable, like camping in the middle of the alumni fields. Again, I'm not saying you couldn't set up a tent and go out there. Humans are very adaptable, but they'd probably hustle you along. So for whatever reason, living in the middle of the alumni fields, not suitable habitat. It was at the last scale, remember, but now that we've zoomed in at that finer grain, it's no longer suitable. But that residential neighborhood up there looks good. So now that we've zoomed into our residential neighborhood, we get even more specific. Let's say you want a swimming pool. No, you need a swimming pool. You won't live anywhere that doesn't have a swimming pool. That's your habitat requirement. So there's a couple places here that would be totally suitable for you, and plenty of places here that would not be suitable for you. Again, this whole residential neighborhood looked like suitable habitat when we were zoomed out, but as we zoom in, we see that in fact, it's no longer suitable. And that seems kind of counterintuitive, but when we look at it this way, hopefully it makes a little bit of sense. You kind of narrow down the process, and birds are likely doing the same thing, right? They're flying back from migration, they're literally taking the 10,000-foot view, probably not that high, but they're looking down at the landscape and saying, okay, that area looks good. They swoop in lower, they're like, okay, within this area, maybe that, maybe this. Then they find an individual cavity and they say, is this cavity tall enough? Is it big enough? Is it secure enough from predators? So the question becomes, if we're going to figure out what kestrel habitat is so we can protect it, create more of it, put up boxes in places that make sense, what is useful to measure about the habitat? So here's some things that might matter according to scientific literature done on kestrels and on other birds. Maybe things about the cavity itself, the house level, that lowest level that we were just talking about. So how high is the cavity? That makes it safer from predators. What direction does it face? It's weird that that might matter, but it actually matters quite a lot when it comes to weather, as it turns out. Prevailing storms come from one direction, and if you have eggs that you're trying to keep warm, having the sun in the morning can be a great advantage in keeping your nest sort of warm and comfy. And then getting the shade in the afternoon when it's really hot out will help keep your chicks from overheating once they've hatched. Hunting perch availability. Are there places I can hunt from around this cavity? So now we're looking sort of at the neighborhood level, that middle level. Presence of competitors, presence of predators. Who are the neighbors, right? This is something that humans are concerned about, and it's something that birds are concerned about too. Are there other species around that are going to make trouble? Plant community composition. Do specific plant species matter? Is it more a matter of just what structure the plants kind of form? Can I hunt here is sort of the question. What's the openness of the habitat like? So when I say openness, openness is, in very short terms, kind of a metric for the angle to the horizon, if I'm standing in the middle of a field. So the higher the angle to the horizon, the less open it is, right? The more trees or buildings or other things are kind of encroaching on your view shed. When you're a visual hunter, you want to be able to see as far as you can, because that's both how you avoid predators like Cooper's hawks, and it's how you find your prey. So maybe they want areas that are, maybe they want a nest that's in a more open patch. Visual obstruction, again, like how easy is it for me to see down to where my prey are? And then at the highest level, that first level we looked at, the landscape level, things like patch size might matter. How big are the fields here? How many fields are there? Are they fragmented? Is there a lot of like edge and just tiny little patches of habitat? Or is there one giant big one? So that's a lot to measure. So what have I actually measured so far? What am I going to talk about? So I went to a bunch of nest sites all around the state, 41 of which were not occupied by kestrels. Every one of these was a box. So somebody put a kestrel box up in each of these sites. 41 of them were occupied by kestrels, 16 were not 31 were not, 16 were occupied by kestrels. I surveyed all those measurements I just talked about, except the landscape scale stuff, which gets done in GIS. At each site, and I took some aerial photos with a quadcopter drone. And if I have some extra time, I'll talk to you about what I'm doing with the aerial photos. And so what did we actually come up with in terms of unoccupied versus occupied? The nests they chose to use and the nests they chose not to use. Well, it looks like direction of the opening does not differ significantly at all. In fact, they're incredibly similar. Part of this is probably because people putting up nest boxes are told they prefer nest cavities facing south or southeast. So on average, that's the direction the cavities were facing in both groups. Cavity height between unoccupied in yellow and occupied in green, no significant difference. The average in both cases was between 3.5 to 4 meters, and they were not significantly different from each other. Distance to various features. How far is the nearest building as a proxy for human interference? How far to the nearest hunting perch? How far to the nearest woody vegetation, so a tree or shrub that's going to possibly interfere with hunting? No significant differences across any of this between the occupied and unoccupied nests. So now we see, it turns out evaluating kestrel habitat as a human is pretty difficult because things you think should matter so far don't seem to matter very much to the kestrels. But let's think about the neighbors. Who else is in the neighborhood and why might that matter? So, other species. There's 2 invasive cavity competitors in our parts of the United States, the house sparrow and the European starling. They were both introduced from Europe. They're now well established. You can see them both on campus. If you take 5 minutes to walk around, you'll probably see both species outside as soon as you leave this building. They're both associated with human structures, so distance to buildings is something that might matter there. Starlings are larger and they're seldom taken as prey. So kestrels can and do eat house sparrows, in addition to competing with them for nest space, but starlings are a little too big for them to tackle. But they will both and have both nested in kestrel nests before. So these competitors could have a negative effect on kestrels. These are native competitors. That should say native. Well, eastern bluebirds and tree swallows are both native species that also nest in cavities. They'll nest in kestrel boxes. Both of them use grassland habitat just like kestrels do. Both of them defend their territory around their box. Tree swallows are a migratory species. Eastern bluebirds are what we call facultative short-distance migrants. So facultative is the opposite of obligate, what I said before. Obligate, you have to do something, you're obligated. Facultative, you can do something if it's convenient. Eastern bluebirds often do migrate, but they don't have to. Sometimes they stick around if it's a mild winter. They can survive on berries and going to bird feeders and that kind of thing. So that might have some role in who gets first dibs on cavities, right? Because if I'm a migratory kestrel trying to compete with cavities for bluebirds who never leave, they've got an advantage in choosing where to settle. And then we've got these guys. All right, apparently they all say invasive competitors, which are miscellaneous species. So that's a house wren. House wrens are aggressive cavity usurpers that puncture eggs. I've not known them to do this with kestrel nests, but they'll do it with a lot of other cavity nesting birds. Basically, they go into a cavity that's already been occupied by another species. They puncture all of the eggs with the bill, and then after the other bird abandons the nest, they come in and build their nest there. Northern flickers are our native woodpecker that's closest in size to American kestrels, and they're kind of the main cavity architect with kestrels. They will also sometimes use kestrel boxes because, I mean, why make your own house if you don't have to, I guess. But they're important for kestrels in the wild because they're the ones who typically make the cavities that kestrels use. In one case, flickers went into a kestrel box and then drilled a hole through the back of the kestrel box into the tree it was mounted on to make a new cavity behind it. So they had like a double layer cavity. I don't know what they were thinking. I guess it was probably pretty secure from predators, but. So we did see some differences in terms of house sparrows and house wren numbers. Both were more abundant at occupied sites than unoccupied sites, but the t-tests for these did not come out to statistically significant differences. This work was done by Shana Hodash, an undergraduate who was working with me 2 summers ago. And as you can see, there's no significant differences detected in any of the other bird species. Yeah, so the question is, so the unoccupied boxes, are they actually used by these other species, or are they just sitting there not used? Which is a good question. And the answer is both. Some of the boxes are being used by competitors, and some of them are totally empty. And for the frequency, this is just how frequently the species were observed in a visual and auditory survey at the site. It doesn't necessarily mean that this box was occupied by that other bird. So there's some question about whether kestrels can kick competitors out of boxes that they really want, or whether they can't do that or don't do that. It's kind of an open question, and it sort of changes the calculus a little, right? Because competitors don't matter if kestrels can evict birds from any site they really want, but we don't know. We don't know behaviorally whether they do that or not. But something did come out as significant after all of those surveys, and that's patch openness. So this metric here is 90 degrees minus the angle of obstruction to the horizon. So higher means more open in this case. And the occupied boxes were in significantly more open habitats than the unoccupied boxes. Okay, that's kind of interesting. What does that mean? Well, this is, again, only 1 year of surveys. I've just finished my 2nd year collecting all of that data, and I'm going to be adding it in and redoing these analyses. We'll see if things change. But it suggests that maybe patch openness trumps all of the other stuff. Maybe they don't really care about the neighborhood as long as it's a nice open field. Neighbors might matter, especially for like house sparrows and house wrens where there was a difference. Maybe those differences will become statistically significant as we get more data, or maybe it won't. Maybe they're just correlates with the habitat. So maybe the areas where kestrels don't nest tend to be in really urban areas where there's tons of house sparrows. So the fact that we see a lot of house sparrows around unused nests isn't the house sparrow's fault in any sense. They're not driving the kestrels away by competition, maybe. They're just there because it's their habitat, not so much the kestrel's habitat. Maybe this openness thing is related to what's called nestling light intensity, which is how much light gets into the box. Some guys measured this in the late 90s and said, hey, boxes that kestrels use have significantly higher light levels inside the box than boxes they don't use. Nobody ever followed up on that work. I've got some light monitors out in my boxes right now. I'm going to be following up on it in the future, but I don't have those data to show you at this time. So openness could be a correlate with that, right? The less shade there is, the less sort of things impinging around the edge of the field, the more light there is in the box. So maybe the light is what matters, or maybe the light's just saying they like open areas. And then another question is, what about foraging habitat? All of this is asking about where they nest, but what about where they forage? As raptors, kestrels can wander pretty widely when they're looking for a place to hunt. They probably use multiple patches within a given territory. So I'm going to be doing a landscape level analysis using GIS. And like I said, it's probable that they're selecting at several scales. So we'll see how much the whole landscape figures into this. And it could be that that whole landscape level sort of overrules all of these other smaller variables. Okay, so I said I was going to talk some about drones if I had time. And it looks like I do have time. Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about what I'm doing with the drones. So this is an aerial photo. There's a nest box. There's me, my field assistant. We took aerial photos at heights of 25 and 50 meters, centered on the nest boxes. And as you can see, as you probably noticed immediately if you're into photography at all, there's a serious fisheye distortion on the drone camera. Like, it's huge. So we have to correct for that and kind of flatten out the image before we can start talking some about what the different habitat looks like. Now, the reason these aerial photos might be useful is they let us see what the kestrel sees when it's assessing the vegetative structure. So if a kestrel is thinking, can I hunt here? Well, there's short grass and bare ground. Not a lot of places for a vole to hide, which means that I'd be able to see them and catch them. Over here, there's a gigantic patch of poison ivy, which doesn't affect birds, by the way. The contact dermatitis from poison ivy is our unique, sort of not unique, but we're one of the few species that actually reacts to it like that. So that's a great place for lots of little critters to hide out. These giant forested areas are much less good. I can't see anything that's going on past these tree canopies, so I wouldn't want to hunt in there. And we can very easily see all of that using the aerial photos. So rather than trying to sort of do a really subjective qualitative analysis, let's get quantitative about it. Let's let the computer tell us what the habitat looks like. So we use a technique called supervised classification to do this, where we basically just make up cover categories. All right, light green is going to be grass. Brown is going to be bare earth. Dark green is going to be herbaceous shrubs like poison ivy. This sort of rusty reddish brown is going to be trees, woody sort of stuff. And this red is going to be that path, which is wood chips. So that's kind of a unique cover class within this paradigm. So I create all of these blobs myself. I assign them all to classes, and I tell the computer, this is what grass looks like. This is what bare ground looks like. This is what treetops look like. This is what a path of wood chips look like. And then I turn the computer loose to classify the whole rest of the image. So just as a reminder, here's what the here's what the raw image that gets fed into the computer looks like. Take a look at it. Note where different cover classes are. Think about how you might be scoring some of these areas, and we'll see how the computer did. So there's our supervised classification. In some cases, the computer did a pretty good job. It identified the giant patch of poison ivy as herbaceous. That's correct. It got that whole woody area as being woody. It picked out the path, no problem. It's got grass and bare ground that are interspersed in kind of a logical, looks approximately correct sort of way. So you can see, does the pointer work? It does. All right, so you can see this big patch of bare ground right here with sort of very sparse grass. We go into the supervised classification, and there it is. And you can look at this here. It says, oh, there's a lot of like shrubs up in this area. Oh yeah, looks like that area is kind of that lighter green shrub color. But there were some areas where it didn't do so hot. Specifically, see this tree right here? All of this right here is a treetop. As you can see, it was like less than half actually categorized as tree. Most of it was categorized as herbaceous. A little bit of it was categorized as grass. And you can see there's big patches elsewhere in the tree canopy that got classified as herbaceous growth. So it's good, but it's not perfect. We can use something called a confusion matrix, which is sort of a funny name, to figure out how well the computer is doing given the input information at actually telling these different cover classes apart. So the best results we got were achieved in areas that only have a few cover classes, like 3 or 4. If you start getting into 6 or 7 or 8, then you get like a real sort of piecemeal disruption, which is pretty easy to see in areas here where it just like assigns tiny, tiny amounts of pixels to a whole bunch of different cover classes. And you can tell it to exclude clumps of a certain size, but you might want that information if you're looking at the sort of microstructure. Like grass that's interspersed with bare ground is very different from grass that's interspersed with shrubs. So our overall accuracy that the computer got sort of in this first round of supervised classification was 81.7% and around occupied boxes and 83.5% for unoccupied boxes. So roughly 4 times out of 5 for it guessed the right cover class for a given pixel. It's not bad, still needs some refinement. There's post-processing that we can do to kind of improve these odds. You can go back and sort of correct the computer and tell it to go try again. But the biggest problem was definitely errors of omission in the woody plants category. So this problem with this tree that was miscategorized as shrubs and grass, that happened at pretty much every site that had trees. And it all kind of depends on what color the leaves are. So let's look at our original image. You see how that tree is so much paler than all the other trees? It's really a lighter green. And that's what fools the computer into thinking that it's herbaceous growth. So computers are great. They can do some really amazing stuff. We can maybe use this to look more at what kestrel habitat is composed of. But it's definitely a work in progress. So that's all I have to talk about for what I've been doing with my research so far. I welcome your questions. I wish to acknowledge my advisor, Michael Reed, and the whole Reed Lab, who have been very supportive and helpful. The undergraduates, Shana and Jordan, who worked with me my past 2 field seasons doing a lot of this work. My funding sources, Don't Auto Advance. Ty, which gave me money for my research, and the Not Alone Ornithological Club, which did as well. I very much appreciate that. And now I'm happy to take your questions. This is a bucket full of baby kestrels that I just took out of a nest. They're maybe 3 weeks old at this point, ready for banding. So this is what they look like when they're waiting for me to put the little bracelets on them so you can identify them. Yes? Oh. Oh, great.
Who had a question?
You talked a lot about the habitat, and I am concerned about the kestrels, and I'm wondering about food. If it was me and I wasn't doing well, the first thing I would wonder about was the food and the food quality, and maybe, that wasn't part of what you were going after, but do you know anything about that? Because in terms of the chemicals that might be affecting their lives, there's the whole food chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is about food and what we know about their food availability and pesticides and how that might be affecting things. The answer is very little research has been done on that so far. I'm not doing that research, but I'm interested in it. So there's a tricky thing about food in that it's really hard to identify what an animal has been eating unless you kill it and cut it open. And you can find out what they're bringing back to the nest once they've got chicks or if they're feeding a female on eggs. You just have to put cameras inside the nest, and then you can watch them every time they come in. You'll see what they're bringing. You can make notes about what they're eating. You can see if the diet's shifting. Actually sampling the things they're eating to find out whether there's pesticides in it. You could go out and trap mammals and get bugs with net sweeps. That's a whole dissertation's worth on its own, and it doesn't happen to be my dissertation. But my impression is they do have enough food. Like the birds that are settling down typically succeed. Like they successfully raise chicks, the chicks fledge. The problem doesn't necessarily seem to be food related in the areas where they nest, but it may be that some areas that were suitable are no longer suitable because there's not enough prey. Censusing prey, like actually finding out some estimate of how many voles are in this field or how many grasshoppers in this field, is a real nightmare. It's not impossible, but it's incredibly hard to do well. Yeah. Jessica.
I have a question. I'm confused about your confusion matrix. No, not really. I had a question about your drone images and auto classification. And I assume that you're using raw images from your drone and running those. And I wonder if you had tried enhancing the images through saturation or contrast or that sort of thing prior, and if that made a difference.
Right. So what sort of image processing, if any, do I do in my drone photos is the question. And I didn't talk about it here, but they actually do get run through a low band pass filter. So you can see this one where I'm doing the classification, the colors are kind of different. The contrast is increased. So you can see like the green up here and the brown down here are very obvious in this photo, somewhat less so in the raw photo. So there is a little bit of contrast increasing post-processing, but if you've got ideas for like other filters to use, I've just been kind of taking the sledgehammeriest approach in terms of trying to increase the contrast. So.
Do you know if it uses color or sort of pixel pattern to parse
I believe that the classification thing that I'm using does coloring.
Okay.
The people online won't hear you.
I don't know if this is just super nitpicky, but as far as the images too, how you were mentioning the fisheye, it might be worth, there are definitely softwares that can correct that post-processing, just as far as spatial analysis, because I mean the images are pretty small, but if you're looking at like a bunch of them and wanted to look at like for some type of, you know, ground cover, even that little bit of distortion could definitely skew you a little bit. Just an idea.
Yeah. So the question or comment is about the distortion in the photos. Yeah, the distortion is pretty severe, and I'm currently like doing my post-processing in GIMP because that's what I've got. And it does flatten it out a little bit, but it's certainly not perfect. Like there's still a lot of distortion that's present here. And there are, in fact, I think Adobe Lightroom, I want to say. There are programs out there that, whoops, oh well, that specifically correct for this very camera. Like through, I guess, a cooperation with DJI or something, they've got a specific undo the distortion of this drone's particular camera tool, which would be really fantastic, but I don't have the software to do that. Yeah. If there's an easy way to do it with free software, I am all ears. Because right now I'm using another incredibly like crude sledgehammery thing with GIMP that basically just like bends and warps the photo and then zooms in to try and remove some of the distortion.
Yeah. So the whole kestrel habitat issue kind of reminds me of the peregrine falcon sort of reintroduction project that happened. So I'm wondering if there could be any human landscape that could serve as a suitable sort of replacement for a natural field, like putting peregrine falcons on, skyscrapers, like their natural cliff habitat. So if you could find maybe like organic farms or fields like that, do you think any of those man-made landscapes could serve as a good kind of replacement habitat for kestrels?
Yeah. Good question. So the question is about sort of human habitats that could serve as good sort of replacements or surrogates for kestrels like they did with peregrine falcons. Peregrine falcons are cliff nesters in the wild, but they've taken to cities like with a vengeance. They're nesting on bridges, they're nesting on skyscrapers. It's worked out really well for the peregrines. Well, as it turns out, kestrels can be city birds too, weirdly enough. I've found them in Somerville, like in Union Square, in like, pretty developed areas. They're in Boston, they're at Logan Airport, which is really open, so they like it there. They're all over Manhattan and Brooklyn. There are people who like watch them there and have newsletters. They nest in broken cornices in buildings. So if the facing kind of around the top of a building has a hole in it, kestrels will go in there and nest. And they'll eat house sparrows, and they can eat urban things and be totally happy. So that's one of the most puzzling things about this, because if kestrels are successfully adapting to urban habitats, why are their numbers still declining so much? And I don't know why that is, but my suspicion is they can adapt to urban habitats, but suitable urban habitats are pretty rare. So they still need those really unobstructed sight lines. They need to not get hit by a truck while they're swooping down and trying to hunt animals. Urban areas are still kind of risky for kestrels. Some of them clearly can pull it off there, but I suspect it is the minority. And they might, in fact, be kind of a different, if you want to talk about stuff like this, like behavioral phenotype. Like it might be most kestrels can't deal with the noise and the smell, but maybe some small number of them can, and they're the ones who are nesting there. In terms of organic farms, yeah, farms are a really useful partner for kestrel conservation. Pretty much all of the occupied boxes I go to across Massachusetts are on farms, because pasture is one of the best places for kestrels to hunt. The cows keep the grass low, and they make it good for hunting. And as long as the pasture isn't being sprayed with hideous pesticides, it can be very good kestrel habitat. So there's definitely a place for kestrels on farms. And they can even be part of your integrated pest management if that's the thing that you're into, because they eat grasshoppers and other critters that could damage your crops.
I have a question about the nest boxes and how the design for the nest boxes were decided upon. Were different designs tested before you put out? You were talking about the lighting and stuff. Has that been tried?
Right. So the question is about nest box design and whether we tried different designs since interior light level might matter. The answer is we didn't try different things at all. And I didn't think or suspect that light levels might matter until a couple of years into the project already, and boxes were already out. Some of these boxes I did put up and put out. A lot of these boxes were put up before I even started my work here. So the box designs, in fact, vary. They're not standardized. So I can include box design as a random effect in models that are looking to explain things. And fortunately, since we're actually measuring the interior light levels, we'll see if there is a significant difference in interior light levels between different box designs. But some of them open from the top, some of them open from the side, some of them have a little ledge for them to perch on outside. There's not a huge variety because the entrance holes are all about the same size and the interior dimensions are all pretty similar. But there's a lot of variety in nest box design, and it wasn't controlled for at all in setting up this experiment. Yeah, that came up later.
A wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Very, very engaging. It's very exciting to have a graduate student presenting in this forum. Can you tell us, for the undergraduates in this audience who might be thinking about going to graduate school, a little bit about your journey to graduate school, picking this wonderful dissertation topic, and maybe a little bit about, are you considering applying for environmental studies type positions, biology? That's my curiosity as opposed to what the undergraduates want to know.
So I guess the question is about my career path. Well, I did my undergrad at Brandeis, not too far away. I was a double major in biology and environmental studies. And after I graduated from Brandeis, I went to work for Mass Audubon, for the Massachusetts Audubon Society. I worked there for 4.5 years, doing all kinds of stuff, including the Breeding Bird Atlas, their State of the Bird reports. I did a Foresters for the Birds program, teaching people how to manage their forest lands to create habitat for birds. Basically just lots of bird nerd stuff. It was a very fun place to work. But I started being interested in the kestrel question while I was there. Kestrels have been my favorite bird for a long time. And when I found out that they were declining and that nobody really understood why, I wanted better research so that we could put up boxes in places that made sense. No one was doing that research, so I figured I'll do the research myself, which is why I came to graduate school. And if you're planning on pursuing a PhD, my one piece of advice to you, two pieces of advice: make sure you have a question that you really want answered. Because if you don't have a question that you really, really care a lot about, and that you're willing to put in a lot of hours and suffer a lot of frustration for, it's going to be a very hard road to hoe. Some people come in without having a specific question. That's okay. You can find that question, but be sure you're passionate about inquiry in general if you don't have a specific question in mind. Not everyone does, and that's fine, but you better be ready to ask questions and sacrifice for them. And second, your advisor is everything. For a PhD especially, make sure you get along with whoever your prospective advisor is. The advisor-mentee relationship is incredibly important. It's going to be the thing that keeps you sane and sort of supports you all through your time. And if they're not going to be there for you, if they're not going to be in your corner, if you don't get along great with them and trust everything they say, don't work in their lab. I've seen it go bad, and it's ugly. But yeah, and you can go straight from undergrad into grad school. Lots of people do that. It's a great path. I can't speak to it because I didn't do it. I took some time off to work, and that was the right path for me, because it let me confirm that there were questions that I needed answered and that I felt were important enough that I had to go do the research to answer them myself, which is the only thing you need a PhD for. If you want to get a professor position at a research university or do your own research, you need a PhD. Otherwise, you can do tons of stuff in conservation with just a bachelor's and field experience. A master's can be great too. But yeah, so be sure you really want to do research if you want a PhD. And in terms of after I finish my PhD, I really enjoy teaching, but I really don't enjoy grading or pretty much any of the administrative work that goes along with teaching. And I'm not enthralled with academia as sort of a career path, so I'm probably going to try and work for the government or a nonprofit doing conservation-related research. We've got a specific conservation problem. How do we help this species? How do we protect this thing? That's the sort of stuff I'm interested in, more than let's publish as many papers as possible in academia. I'm not a pure science guy. I'm very applied.
And
If you have time, I'll happily take more.
I will end with the last question. Thank you for the career advice and the beautiful presentation. What's next in your research?
Oh, next in my research, I'll stick around after, by the way, if you still have questions. What's next in my research? I've got more drone pictures to analyze, so I'm going to work on refining sort of how that works. I've got more field data to put into that, so we're going to be working with fieldwork, and I'm going to be doing the landscape scale stuff. So I haven't done any of the really broad scale analyses yet at all. So I'm going to be sitting down with GIS and looking at all of my sites and figuring out how much the patch size matters. And then in the end, I'm going to build a gigantic predictive model that tries to tell you where to put up Kestrel boxes that involves the landscape stuff, the cavity stuff, the territory level stuff. That's kind of going to be the capstone of my dissertation work, hopefully. And I'm also going to be doing some work with the Cooper's hawks and starlings to see if we can detect effects of when they show up in a place and when kestrels decline and if there's really a relationship there, or if it's just habitat.
Okay, well, thank you very much.